Welcome, coaches. It's hard to believe that we are on webinar number 9. So we're over 11 weeks into this process, and we feel at Rugby Ontario that the webinars have been outstanding, taking a negative and turning it into a positive for our coach and player development. It's been excellent. What we focused on in the first few weeks has been very much technical with respect to core skill delivery and how we're going to improve our players through coaching and training. What we're going to look at tonight is bringing it all together. So literally looking at grassroots, club, high school, and the progression from those areas into the provincial program and then into the national program. And as luck would have it, we couldn't have a better individual to take us on this journey tonight than I'd like to welcome Mike Curran. Mike played rugby in high school at John Fraser and then went on to Acadia University. He then came back to the province and started coaching at Brampton RFC, and while he was working as a teacher at Streetsville Secondary School. Now, from there, he developed Streetsville into one of the powers in Ontario, and a big component of that was the development of the Mississauga Blues Rugby Football Club, so that the players from Streetsville Secondary School had a direct pathway to club rugby and then on to the provincial program. And then all of us in Ontario know Mike then stepped into the provincial program, very successful at numerous levels, especially at the U18, where he brought home a national championship for Ontario, and then progressing in his personal development to where he is now coach of Canada U18. So on behalf of Rugby Ontario, I'd like to welcome Mike.
Thanks, Con, for the introduction. Much appreciated. And thanks, everyone, for giving the time. Before we get going, we've got James Topping there. I can see him, and I just want to send a congrats to him on Cardiff Met. So, James, you can give us a wave. Everyone can see you. And hopefully things work out in September with this. But we love seeing guys move on to other opportunities. So, right on. I think the plan for today, I'm just going to share my screen here. Is to really look at how we try to align the U18 national program with club and provincial rugby and high school rugby as well. So I've got some thoughts there on what we can do, and then understanding that most of this is based off my observation and then some experience there in the program. Sean, you can see that screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So first things first, Con gave us a little bit of an introduction, but I think he's a bit flattering, to be honest. I guess the point of this is to just show that within the grassroots system, I've got some long experience in sort of all the avenues. I've left off the university college stuff, or most recently worked with Brock Women's Rugby with Smurds and Fitz and Amanda there. But started coaching there at Streetsville Secondary School. Mark Smurd and Paul Neufeld started that program and were kind enough to include me. So I've got a long experience there with the high school stuff. So I understand the challenges that are there, and it's a lot different than coaching in a national program. From then I started coaching club rugby at Brampton, and then joined the group of guys that started the Mississauga Blues, and have coached everywhere there from under 18 up to senior men and women. So experience across the board. And then with Ontario, cut my teeth with the U15 boys with Steve Porter, and then moved through various Ontario programs since then. And then in part of the national program for the last 5 or 6 years, first with the 17s with Jim Delaney, and then now to the national 18s. So I think the point of the introduction is that understand I'm not a professional rugby coach. I'm very much an amateur coach. I dedicate sort of time on my own, but within that pathway over the last sort of 20 years, I've seen some things and accumulated a little bit of knowledge. And then at this program, I can see where our trends are and try to connect all the way down. So that's the hope. So the goal for tonight really is to look at the Canada U18s program in terms of the talent identification and player development, and then how we structure those things. And then I think is to create discussion on the Canada Under 18s men's program with Rugby Ontario, and then club school programs, and how we sort of facilitate that development as a group rather than people working independently. I just want to say, though, that if there are people on the webinar not from Ontario, much of the examples I'm going to use and the observations I take are from the Ontario experience because the webinar is hosted by Rugby Ontario series. So the realities in the different regions of the country are very different. And if I was making this presentation in Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, or the prairies, we would have different observations. Some the same, but some different. in order to achieve our goals today, this is sort of the agenda as I see it. We're going to look at the program goals and the structure of the 18s, at least what it's looked like for the past 4 years, to give some context. Then we're going to focus in on how we select players, what the process looks like, and some of the challenges that come with that process. We'll look at the key themes of the Canada U18s in order to grab sort of a connection to what we're doing in clubs and schools and how we can integrate. If we don't understand the content that one is trying to achieve, I'm not sure that we can find connectivity between the programs. And then lastly is to look at how we in our various silos can jointly support the national team athletes. I think it's naive to think that national team athletes are developed simply by national team programs. I think in rugby in Canada, particularly being an amateur pathway, it takes the whole village. And then we'll finish up with question and answer. Sean is going to pop in with questions at the end of sort of the slide, each slide or each segment, and then we'll go from there, and we'll see where we are. Okay, first things first, when we talk about the Rugby Canada Under 18 program goals, is to identify talent, and that's the big piece. When the national pathway starts with the under 18s, and then moves into the Canada 20s and the Pacific Pride and the senior men. And then, of course, there's a sevens branch sort of attached in with the 15s for various tournaments and structures. Because we're the entry level, really our goal is to take the players, the top players in Canada, when we go to certain events, 50 or 24, depending on what it is, and to put them in an environment where they're under pressure to see sort of what filters to the top and to see where we need to make corrections and do some development to move players through the pathway. But understanding as the entry level, we're really focused on talent identification. And the last piece is that we're pressurized environments. We have to see how players perform and how they utilize skills under pressure, whether that, in my opinion, has to be in game-based scenarios. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The second thing the program tries to do is to develop the technical skills and the tactical understanding required for international rugby. So players are going to move through the pathway from high school to club to provincial. And then when we get to the Canada program, we try to up the pressure so that we can get them introduced to that international environment. So it's the first time is not at the U20s in a World Trophy or with the senior men in a World Cup. We need to prepare players to live in that environment. And the last thing is to create a learning environment that is challenging and is fun. And I think that's an important piece. Okay, so when we look at the structure of the U18 program, I've sort of tried to layer everything in there without, and Sean and Con have done a really good job of creating a flow chart that encompasses the entirety of the pathway system as we see it in Canada, and understanding that the pathway is open. There's many entry points. This is how we see the U18 program in its structure, with the red boxes being our touch points of the national program, the gray being the other rugby touch points. And if you're part of a program that's not listed in one of those, I do apologize. I try to keep them general on purpose, understanding that one player's reality is not every player's reality. Some guys play a lot of sevens, some don't play sevens at all. Others play in a high school, others only play clubs. So just understanding that they all intermix. The point there is that the complete picture for a rugby player is not contained within the Canada program. It's bigger than that. There's a lot of stakeholders involved in moving a player through in their development pathway and their journey. So it's important to understand how those all work. And the last one in discussing with Con this morning, and it's an important piece I left out, so I've added it there, is that in our green is that strength conditioning and trying to manage what that program looks like along the side. And that's really throughout the year. So if we just talk through this very quickly, if we look very at the bottom, we've got high school 15s, March to June with club, June to August, and that's as a U17. So generally speaking, a player plays a high school season, their grade 11 year. They play a club season after their grade 11 year for probably the provincial U17s. And then they're identified in some regard and they're invited to a regional camp. We run 4 across the country. We're going to focus on the one in Ontario. Throughout the 4 camps, we get about 150 to 200 players, and they're identified through various pathways. So whether they've been identified at a provincial competition, or they've been identified through the talent identification network that Adam Kleberger is leading now. There's a lot of ways in which a player can come, but the idea is we try to get sort of the top 50 players into the Ontario camp. The camp will last about 3 to 4 days, and from there we'll select the top 50 players from across the country to represent Canada on 2 teams at the North America 4 Series, which has happened in San Diego the last few years. But between there, we know that players are going to return to fall sevens and or other sports they play, probably hockey to be fair. Following the North America 4 Series, we return with our players and they'll go back to their winter academies, indoor training, S&C programs, and then they'll start another high school 15 season and a club season before coming into our summer series in July, which sort of the top 24 as we identify them. This year, of course, challenging because we haven't had a high school 15 season, and we'll see what a club season looks like. But And obviously the July Summer Series for this year is canceled. So what this program looks like going forward, we'll sort of see when we get there. But this is how it's traditionally worked. I guess we'll try to manage this as a daunting without the interaction between the audience and myself. So we'll go as we are, and then Sean will throw in questions. So the first section we want to look at is how we select and what our process looks like. And I think anything with Homer Simpson is better because we learn everything from The Simpsons. So this is Homer. We thank him for volunteering his time coaching kids, but boy, is he wrong on that quote. I believe for me, the selection process is the most difficult. It's certainly the one that's the most stressful for me and requires a lot of reflection and wavering back and forth sometimes. And one we take very seriously, and understanding that it's not a scientific process. Unfortunately, it's just about considering as many factors as we can, and you hope you make the right decisions. But I think what's important is that our pathway is designed that players can develop at different times and come into the pathway at different times. And I've seen it many times coaching the Ontario 19s, is that players who weren't successful with the Canada 18s come in with the 19s, and they just develop a little later and they're into the 20s program with Canada. So anyway, there we are. Our process we look at 4 sort of selection criteria when we're picking our team. And I understand this is not super relevant to high school and club coaches in a way that they can, because certainly at my high school, I don't have a choice of players. I sort of get whoever comes to practice. But within an Ontario context, this is the selection process we use, or if you have players at your high school you think could play for Canada, these are the 4 criteria we look for. We're looking for players that are large in stature and big. So generally speaking, we're talking about height. We're looking for players that are fast, and there's physical metrics there based on the position they play. We're looking for players that are skilled. This guy's balancing plates on sticks with his feet and stuff, but I think that's pretty skillful. And then you've got that X factor, that's something, and we get that a lot. This player works as the hardest working person, the most dedicated, the toughest, the smartest. There's all those little things there that make a rugby player different than other athletes, and we understand that. So it's a selection criteria, certainly. Once we have our 4 criteria, we sort of group people into 3 sections. You're green lit, which means you're ready for international rugby sort of in the next year. If you can check off 3 or 4 of those boxes. If you've got 1 or 2 of them, you're in the yellow area. And if you only have 1, then generally speaking, you need some further development, and probably, you're not going to go forward. It's the yellow group that really causes the most sort of debate, discussion, and consideration, because there are factors that we look at that might have contributed to underperformance in a camp, where we have to look at potential, and that's sort of where we look at the influencers. So this is one where we might be able to start some discussion, and there's certainly lots of debate when I talk to representative coaches in provincial pathways and national programs is how do we manage these influencers, and they're legitimate and they're real, and some are more important for certain athletes than others, but they're things that we have to consider. So we talk a lot about performance versus potential at under 18, and that's a big one. Potential is massively important. Performance, we have to be comfortable with the fact that this is an entry level and it's a process, and you're not going to get World Cup type performances from under 18 athletes. It's about how they can sort of develop and move forward. But then the environment is something we have to consider as well. So if we look at some of the influencers related to performance, we have to look at if we accept that the guys in the green group, we don't really have to consider a lot here for them. We're moving on. So when we look at these influencers, we're focusing on that yellow group. Some of the things that might have mitigated a performance in a camp is what kind of learning style does the athlete have? Are they someone that needs to see it drawn up on a whiteboard in order to understand what's going to happen on the field? They could be a step behind because they don't understand verbal instruction. They need to do it first, so it might take some time. Prep time for them, maybe they haven't played rugby since mid-August because now they're into hockey season and we have a camp in October. Their physical load, potentially the amount of information, the amount of rugby is just beyond them. They haven't experienced anything like that. They might be a heck of a good athlete. They might be quick, but it's just the sheer volume of rugby in a 4-day camp. Also looking at what day it is. They might have been excellent on day 1, but by day 4, they're really broken down and there's not a lot left there. So all these are factors when considering whether a player moves forward for us or whether we send them to a place with where they need to do a little bit more development. When we look at the potential, their physical metrics is a big one. Particularly when we're talking about rugby, when you're profiling a team and building a team at international level, you have to be aware of physical metrics. And sometimes it's a bit of a point of contention that we're just going to take all the big kids. And I'm not sure that's true because the reality is we just don't get that many that hit the physical metrics, to be fair. If we had 100 kids try out, we might only have one that's sort of that 6'6", which would put him in that physical metrics where we have to take him, regardless of what his skill level. We'll build that as we go, but generally speaking, we have to consider physical metrics. Is he a big kid or a super fast kid, or is it a kid who's already working out and he's physically fit, but maybe his skills are a little less? So these are some of the things we look at. What kind of rugby environment do they come from? Potentially they don't play in a high school. Potentially they don't play a club. The important one that's coming up for us recently is we're starting to see that it's critically important. I believe that players are in the Rugby Ontario program somehow. And it's not to say they don't play sevens, they don't play anything else, but the players who are coming through the Rugby Ontario pathway have experienced a level of pressure and speed the players who only play club and high school don't get. And that's the reality. It's nothing to do with coaches, and it's nothing to do how good your team is. It's just simply the speed and the pressure by the top athletes or athletes all dedicated to the game that they get. And when the kids come to the national level, they're able to manage that pressure a little better. So when we talk about rugby environment, it is important. It is a factor. If a player only plays high school, we have to look at, well, what's their next 12 months sort of going to look like? So I suppose that the message is, if you're a high school or a club coach, and I'm both, if you have a player who's serious about the game and wants to move forward, I think we have to encourage them to go play for the provincial setup. And we understand there are obstacles there. We just got to work with them to break those down. I'll give you a story. We had Paul Myers called me this year about a player who is excellent, but there were some limitations on being able to engage with the program. And we don't have to get into what those are, but we were able to get that player in, that he was interested, and then we were able to start to work with what the factors are, getting rides and things like that, and we make it work. So I think when we're talking about the rugby community in Canada, we have to remember the grassroots is still very amateur. And because of that, you get volunteers and they're willing to do all kinds of things for players to make that happen. So the other piece of potential that's critically important when looking at a player, my belief is that if you have a player who can take that verbal instruction and turn it into physical action, is critically important as a learning process. And if you have players that are sort of on the edge there, where they're performing well, but then maybe they're inconsistent, but they're able to take those verbal cues and create some physical action, I think you've got something there. So part of that is that ability to learn and to take instruction. And then secondly is age. This year we didn't have a lot of underagers coming to Ontario because of the combined under 18s and 20s regional camps. But in the past, we've had players coming in the 2-year window, and age matters. If you're looking at players that are sort of they're in around the same area, and you consider all other things, and one's a year young, so there's 2 years to put them through the program. Sometimes it's worth taking a chance there. And then lastly, and I think which is really important that often we forget, and I think this goes to Ontario programs as well, or any rep program, is the environment. The speed of the game is different than the players see at a high school or a club, or if they primarily only play sevens and then they get dropped into a 15s national camp. The speed is there. The pressure is greater. One, just putting on a training jersey with the national logo really stresses. It can cause some anxiety in kids, and it takes them a while to get used to it. Now, the other one we often forget is roommates. Often when we go on a tour, you're room with someone you don't know, they might snore, they might sleepwalk, they might stay up late. There's a lot of reasons why maybe their players fatigued or not performing in the morning. And then other language, and not just language in barrier in English to French or so on, but also the rugby language. Sometimes we're using terms that are foreign to players. They're not used to them, and it takes a while to figure them out. It causes anxiety. But all these things, when you put them together, are sort of the influencers that have to happen when we talk about making selection. So when we take our sort of criteria and our process and grouping players into those 3 categories, and then we consider the influencers, generally speaking, what you get is we all sit in a room as coaching staff at a camp. So we debrief with some of the players after the day's activities, and then the coaches sit down and we start watching video and going through each player, and we start to group them. And I've just got 2 slides from a depth chart document we created for one of our regional camps. It's not the Ontario camp, and I've grayed out the players so you can't see who they are anyway. This would be the first page in the document. The icons there that you'll see beside some of the players are not the same as the one I used in the last slide, but we were limited by Microsoft icons. So understanding though, we still have the same things there. And what we do have is a little icon for underage. And the one we found was a little infant, but it's not to say that the person with that beside them is in need of some special attention. It's just they're younger than everybody else. So then we break them into our 3 color categories. If they're in the green group, obviously they're ready for international competition. And for us, that's our North America 4. The red group would be not at standard. They still need some work. And then the yellow is development needed. Does not mean they don't move forward. It just means that we have to be aware that we've got some gaps to fill. And we work with them before they get to the camp or to the NA4 series, or we just make that a piece of focus for them. And then what we do is we take the players and we group them. So we would have a slide like this for every single position. So this is our front row group. We would just organize and we put the little icons beside them and we consider where everyone would be. We'd have a second row slide in the back row and halfbacks and centers and back three. And then when our process is done, we'll have 4 documents like this and we'll layer them on top of each other for a national document. We'll put all the greens and the yellows, and then generally the red doesn't make it into our selection document where we pick the players, but it does go into our national depth chart because they have come into a national program. So then we can track them as they move through. And then once we've got all our greens and all our yellows, we put them together and we select our national team. This year's NA4 selected 50 players. At the end of our 4 regional camps, we had 37 greens. Obviously then we went into the yellows to select the other 13 players. We had 1 player couldn't go because of injury, so technically I guess we selected 14 players. There's no slight against the guys that were in the yellow group. I thought this was the best group of NA4 players we brought down to the NA4 in a couple of years. They were very successful. There's a lot of talent there, and selecting the group that went to our July series was incredibly difficult. But I guess the point there with the 37 is that we still haven't got to a point within our national programs where we've created a surplus of talent. We'd like to get to a point where we're selecting 50 of 70 greens or 80 greens. And in order to run an effective high performance program, we need to create that surplus of athletes, and we're just not there yet. So understanding this year, because they were joint 18-20s camps, we did invite less 18s this year than we had in the past. We didn't bring a lot of the younger guys in, but still it's something we need to be aware of as high school and club coaches, because look, the high school guys, I believe, are the most important in this pathway, because they're the guys will go find the players and for the most part introduce the bulk to rugby. You're going to walk around the school and find these grade 9s that play other sports and you're going to convince them to come play rugby. And then you coach them for 4 years and you get to work with them. And so I think being aware of what the gap analysis and the gaps are within national programs and provincial programs are critical to get to the high school coaches, because without the high school coaches, I don't think you get a lot of the players. Rugby is not a sport where people just look it up en masse as something they're going to do. They need a little pushing, and you'll find the most successful sort of high school programs are the ones with the coaches who are out there chasing kids in the hallway and getting guys out to training and challenging players to try something else or making it interesting and fun, and they give it a go. So that's where we're at with that one. So I mean, my observations here for part 1 and what we're missing, we don't have a lot of height. We're not getting a lot of height. We're getting enough to get by. We get enough for the second row. We're a little undersized in the back row. Generally speaking, we certainly don't have any height in the back 3. So, I mean, if we're looking at filling that gap, getting out there and finding those guys who play basketball or volleyball to come out and utilizing that in our back 3 positions allows us to change the way we play. And the last one is sort of that awareness and skillfulness. And I'm a big fan of Richard Shuttlesworth. And I sort of got a chance to talk to him a little bit last summer and summer before when Khalil and the Misfits brought him in for a coaching session. He talks a lot about skills versus game awareness. And certainly within the Ontario setups, we're seeing players come with skills. There's no doubt about it. They have skills. They can pass off their left hand and their right hand. They tackle generally well. They're pretty good in the breakdown area, good footwork. But when you put them in game environments where there's pressure, the game awareness doesn't show. The decision-making isn't there. So, I mean, I guess the challenge there is we have to reflect on our practice at high school and at club, and I do the same. I'm not immune to this. We have to look at, how often we play games with the players. Are we giving them the outcomes before we play the games? Are we active within the coaching session? Are we challenging them through constraining the games and providing reward for meeting certain requirements? But that's sort of where we are. And if we can up that game awareness, partnered with the skills, I think we're doing fairly well at the moment. Then I think that we see improvement across the game, and then we're going to start to push that surplus of talent up to the 20s, up to the pride, into the national men's program, and then of course into professional rugby as we have it now. So hopefully we see all these guys playing for the Arrows someday. But there we are. That's sort of where I am in the end of the first section. Sean, any questions so far that we want to get to? Or
yeah, there's a few that came in, but that are probably for later on, because I think you'll touch on some of it. But one that relevant to kind of what you've talked about. You talked about potential versus performance. So
sure,
maybe speak a bit to how you manage development versus performance. Not only in how you coach, but also with the athletes' mindsets.
Okay, great. So James could probably jump in here and tell me whether I do this well, but Certainly, when we prepare a team, we always want to win all our games. There's no doubt about that. We go down to San Diego and we want to go 4 for 4 against Americans. We want to win. We want to win all the games. But we have to understand that the goal here is to identify that talent and to allow players a chance to develop. So for us, we have some policies within our program that are non-negotiable. Every player that goes has to play half a game. Like that's a no-brainer for us. So obviously, when you have 2 squads of 25, everybody's going to play 30 minutes, and you're going to depend on a couple guys to play a bit more than 30 minutes. But everyone's going to play at least 30 minutes, and everyone's going to start a game. And that's the plan there, because we're really talking about we are not tactically trying to win the games, and that winning is going to be part of a larger process. So we want to make sure that the development piece is number one. So players don't develop and we don't identify talent. We don't achieve our goals if players aren't playing and they're not on the field. The other piece there is that when we talk about a review process, it's about bettering the athletes. It's not about, we do get on to bettering the team. Of course, we'll look at tactical opportunities, but a lot of it comes back to those skills that we're looking for from players and how we can develop them in a game context. So when we talk about the performance versus development of the program, I think that's where we're at, is that we have to accept failure. We have to be comfortable in the fact that when we play games a lot in training or leading up to competitions, that we're not going to see success all the time. And when we go into games, we're not necessarily going to win every game, though we try to. There's no doubt about it. It's not to say winning's not important, but for us, there's other things that are more critical. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's probably good enough we can move on from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we can always come back to the selection criteria. I'm just cognizant of the time there, and I think I'm rambling a little bit. So when we talk about the key themes of the Canada teens, it's there's some bits there we talk about so we can give context on what are the things that we're looking to do. For us, the big one is that we need to be focused. I think I find myself failing there too at a high school level, and that you get caught up in all the things in rugby you need to cover. And in 2015, I was at my first year coaching Rugby Ontario. I didn't have a clue at U15. Mark Smurden was with me there, and Steve Porter. And anyway, we got through the year, stumbled through it. I was coaching a pretty talented group. Andrew Coe was there, and Brendan Blakey, and Lucas Rumble, and Kalini, and Tierney. They're all on that team. So I'm sure they won games. It had nothing to do with Smurden, Porter, or I. But anyway, it was at the postseason review, and Sean McDonough was coaching, I want to say, the 17s. And he went up there and he listed all the different capacities in rugby that you had to deal with as a coach. And I think there was 14 or 15. And his message was, look, we could work on all these things in the duration of our Rugby Ontario summer and make a marginal gain in all of them, very small gain, or we can focus on 3 or 4 of them and make significant changes in players. And that's sort of resonated with me. And when we design a program or we periodize our coaching or our season, focus on the 3 things or 4 things that you're going to make a significant impact on the players is critical. And let's not move on from those until we see some deep understanding and some improvement. So for the Canada U18s, we've identified the contact area as number 1, and our management of pressure number 2, and then our decision-making process as number 3. So for the contact area, the picture I've got there is kid David, who goes to Streetsville, plays the Oakland Crusaders, and he's in the Canada program. And I just like this picture because one of our themes there for the clear-out player is the tackler, and I think this is grossly illegal, but the referee doesn't call it, but I think it's a great example of tackle the tackler. This is what we're getting to. So when we talk about the contact area for us, we focus a lot on the work of the ball carrier. Dave Butcher did a great webinar there a couple of weeks back, and I thought his message and technical pieces were spot on, and I'm a big believer. So I would defer you there for the contact pieces or the technical pieces, but certainly for us, we focus on the ball player with options when he hits the ground, on fighting to get through the line. And then we look at the work of the player off the ball. And then for us, a big one is to engage the bad guy while our ball carrier is still on his feet. And then if the ball carrier does go to ground, we eliminate the bad guys in order to affect the fold of the defense. So a clear out player is a numbers game. If we send one player in to clear out, he's got to be accurate in which he removes a defender. So it's 1 for 1. In a perfect world, 1 clear-out player would occupy 2 bad guys. That'd be wonderful. But the worst-case scenario is that we have a ball carrier on the ground and 2 or 3 support players over a breakdown, and the defenders have 15 guys on their feet. It's just non-negotiable for the 18. It's not acceptable. And then, of course, we talk about in defense, we'll work on work off the ball or pressuring the breakdown. Though generally speaking, our policies for the 18s is to be pretty passive there through the middle of the field, but pressure the breakdown in the wide channels. But So we do a lot of work in the contact area. We do a lot of work on pressure, utilizing, creating pressure and then managing pressure in both attack and defense. So part of that is sort of explore with them through game-based, through games, constraining the games. How do we identify different patterns and different pictures from the defense? And then how do we manage the pressure in which they apply to us? So do we try to go through them? Do we try to go around them? Or do we try to go over them? So these are the little bits. And then the defense, we really look at how do we get everybody on their feet? How do we get width in our line? And then how do we create pressure through line speed? So these are the big sort of pictures. And then the last one for us is sort of our decision-making. And the piece there, their decision-making is that we have to be game-based when we're training in order to get guys to make decisions. So we try to avoid at all costs closed outcome activities. So one where a player is going to perform action A or B and it equals C always. So we try to keep them open-ended activities and in games. Part of the decision-making is we have to be pretty detailed on the process of training. So the first piece for us is that we must preview the session. The preview's got to give us what is the language, what are the things we're going to try to get. So what's the key performance indicators for the session? The players have to know that before they go in. Then we need to get into the game and we need to have coaches moving, so active within the session. And then we utilize a small voice, big voice relationship with coaches. So there's a lead coach, we call him the big voice. He's gonna manage the shape of the game, the constraints, might change the rules. And then we've got small voice coaches that are active within certain small units or working with certain players or driving outcomes from attack or defense. So there's constant questioning as we're playing. We try to mitigate the amount of time we're stopping. And when we do stop, we're going to try to pull the information out of the players sort of based on what they've performed or what they've seen or what their options are related to our preview. And then we try to review the session. And I will offer that that's probably a piece that we have to do the greatest work on, is how do we review training sessions with players. I think we do a relatively good job of training matches or reviewing matches, but reviewing training sessions is a point of work. So certainly a lesson for me out of the COVID-19 is we're doing a lot of work here remotely on Huddle and Zoom. And it's not a thing as a coach that I've utilized effectively, I think, upon reflection. So this is probably a medium in which we'll use for sort of reviewing those training sessions, because we have to check with the athletes to see where their understanding is and to see what they need out of the games. But if we focus on the decision-making, it drives the way we run our program and the way we have coaches plan to review and interact with players, if decision-making is the piece. So anyway, those are our three little points that we focus on as the key themes within the Canada 18s program. So our process looks like we play a lot of games in the context of our shape. So big picture, if we're playing in a 1-3-3-1 or a 1-3-2-2, I don't think it matters in the shape. There's general themes that you get within any shape, whether you play with layers, whether it's 2 or 3 layers, whether you have unders runners off a ball carrier, whatever the themes are within your shape, whether you have to play in 3 channels, we can build into those. We can constrain the games to get the shape of our attack without saying, okay, let's run a 1-3-3-1 from a scrum. Because the reality is that at under 18, there's not that many consecutive phases strung together. I mean, I think successfully, if you're at 8 or 9, you probably scored already. Most times would end before that. So really it's how do the players adjust to the game shape on the fly? And part of that is just taking those themes and putting them in the game context. But then also looking at the way we run sort of activities or where you do the small part pictures. We try to give the guys the pictures and patterns that they're going to see in the game because of what we caused by our shape. So the way we move the defenders around. And we can talk a little bit about that later on if people need clarity on what I'm talking about. I put a couple slides together where we've drawn up the pictures, and we can come back to that. The second one is that we take those. So if you backwards design, so if we run a 1-3-3-1 shape and we understand the pictures that we create, we also look at the requisite skills required to execute within those pictures. So for example, we need to get a drawn pass. Because of the picture, we get a 4v2, so we need to have a drawn pass, or potentially we have to look at holding lines and blocking lines to come in a layer. So we take those requisite skills and we put them into our nuts and bolts to start every training session. And the name nuts and bolts changes all the time. Adam Roberts with the U20s came with us to San Diego, and he uses the word hygiene drills, which is fine. I've used groundhog before, but it's those things you start the training with. So So you might divide your team into groups of players, and they run through stations 3 minutes at a time. And they're little activities that really zoom in on those requisite skills. So clear out, ball carry, a little bit of tackle, a little bit of draw pass, and those things that we constantly come back to that allow us to play within the shape and the pictures that we create. And the last thing we do that I think we do fairly well is we utilize a pretty comprehensive plan to review process, not just for the players, but also for the coaching team. And a commitment to a plan to review means that days are pretty long, but I think it's rewarding, and it really challenges the coaches as well as the players. I mean, the U18 program is the entry point for national team coaches as well. So I've been around for the 5 years, but the coaches within the program have changed readily and consistently and moved on to various programs, whether it's in the men's pathway or the women's pathway or into sevens or into provincial U19 programs. But we've had a number of coaches come through and former players making the jump to coaching. So we have to be aware of the planning and the review process for coaches as well. And we could talk about a little of those in the question and answer, or if Sean gets a question related to them as well. So here's the trends that I've seen from an Ontario perspective over the last sort of 3-4 years. The evidence in Ontario of work in the contact area is there. Like when we come to our 4 regional camps, we don't have to spend a lot of time with Ontario athletes convincing them of the necessity to be accurate in the contact area and to be physical and to eliminate defenders in a way that they're not able to play on the next phase or they're affecting the defensive shape. They have that already. We don't have to do a lot of work with them on tackle the tackler. They understand the concept. We might use language that's different than them, but it's not a stretch. So I will say to the players coming in through the Ontario pathway, get this already. And it allows us to start to increase the pressure in the game. So we get to challenge that game awareness a little bit greater. We find the players generally have pretty limited experience with film review. They might watch film, but we're not sure that consistently they understand what they're looking at. Certainly they don't do the work before they watch it or before they perform. So there isn't anything to anchor the review to following a performance. Thirdly, we find that players do struggle with the game awareness piece. And, I'm not sure that would be a uniquely Canadian problem. I think if you're looking at under 18 players and their process of maturation, that's probably similar across the world. But I think if we're aware that we're seeing in the national program, potentially it could change our best practice at the club and the high school level. Certainly for me, it has changed me as a high school coach, seeing what the trends are as a national program. When I go back to my high school, we play games for an hour and we just constrain them, and the outcomes are different, but largely we're just playing games after game after game. And we get our sort of themes and what we need out of the game day stuff. It's challenging as a coach. It's tiring. You've got to think on the fly. You've got to be comfortable with the fact that the players, you're not going to have all the answers. It's totally fine. You just got to continue to challenge the players to sort of reflect on what they're seeing and to rationalize their decisions. And then it just goes through that learning process. And the last one for us is kicking is not a thing. Tactical kicking across the country is not a thing. Players aren't comfortable with it. If you do get a player who's comfortable putting the ball into space because he sees an opportunity, he's generally looking for some sort of validation from a coach on the sideline, which tells me they're not encouraged to do it very often. And if he does put into space, the other players in the field aren't prepared for it. So it's just not something that's part of our game. So, and that's a big piece for me. Certainly when I reflect on the games we play at club and at provincial and at high school, do I have rewards for people who kick it into space and we get outcomes for it? Probably not. So it's something in my own practice I have to go back and reflect on. But across the country, kicking tactically in Canada is not great. And I think you can go all the way up to Kingsley Jones, and he'll probably say the same thing about the national men's program. It's just not a part of our game at the moment that is an area of opportunity. And Con and Sean have done a great job sort of getting those webinars out. Ryan Jones, I think, is leading that kicking portal and working with the provincial players. So that's a big step forward. I think is really important. That's the end of the key themes piece. Sean, I don't know if there's any questions there or things we want to talk about.
Yep, we got a few that came in. So one that you kind of finished with was how your coaching at the national program has influenced your coaching at high school.
Sure.
How does your coaching change, I guess, as you engage at the different levels, and does your focus change when you're engaging with the different athletes?
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story with the first 3 years ago when 1-3-3-1 became like the talk of the town. 4 years ago, starting to play around with shape. I went back to my high school And man, were we good at running a 1-3-3-1. We played a game at a small private school here in Mississauga. And I think we strung together 24 phases playing in a 1-3-3-1, sideline to sideline to sideline. Man, oh man, did we look good. We went forward 5 meters in 24 phases and then turned the ball over. So for me, I think the biggest thing I've learned is that you can't do the same things in the national program that you do at the high school level or the club level. Simply put, the athletes are not the same, and nor are their needs. They're just not there. High school rugby, we look at different sort of beliefs in what we want in the development. Certainly at the national program, I think what we try to create is sort of a high standard or a bar of which the athletes in our program are trying to achieve. They're trying to get to it. And if you take that as a model, you understand that not everyone's going to get to the bar. You're going to leave some people behind where they're just not there yet to get to the bar. Whereas in my high school program, it's more like a lift where we're lifting all the players up together. So we're starting at zero and we're building their competencies, and we're only going to move as fast as our sort of weakest players, or weakest probably isn't the term, the ones with the greatest opportunity for development, we should say that. So the focus has to change. And but I will say that in the terms of development, what I have recognized is if winning a game at the Canada U18s is not the be all and end all, it can't be at my high school either. It's just not there, right? So it's got to be about creating experience where players want to keep playing rugby, where they enjoy playing, they're learning, they're having fun, and then how serious it gets and how pressurized it gets, I think, is dependent on as they're moving through the pathway. Trying to create a national program at high school is irresponsible, in my opinion, and it's just sometimes I have to pull myself back a little bit. We're like, okay, look, I can't want it more than the guys, so we've got to find that balance there a little bit.
Another question that came in ties in pretty well to kind of your answer there. So you talked about obviously the different needs of the athletes at the national program versus at a high school or club level, and you talked about the 3 priorities you have at the U18. In your opinion, what are kind of the areas that should be focused on at the club or high school level with that demographic of athlete? Yeah,
sure. I think with the club or the school, depending on your age grade, I think you need to within your club or within your high school create a bit of a curriculum. So for us at Streetsville, and Mark Smyrn is now the director of rugby at Mississauga Blues, so things may have changed since I was there last. And I mean, I would offer you to reach out to Mark Smyrn if you're interested in this, because I think he's a good resource there. But we would prioritize certain skills at grade 9 that would be different than grade 10. That would be certainly different than grade 11 and 12. We wouldn't spend a lot in our U14, U15 group, which is sort of our grade 9s, grade 10s. We wouldn't spend a lot of time on shapes and big picture organization. We would really focus in on smaller pictures. So can we get players to create layers? So can they support off the ball appropriately? Do we look at the decisions they make based on the patterns of the defense? So do they pass away from a lot of defenders into open space, or do they tuck their head and carry it in? And how can we fix those corrections? So I don't know what the silver bullet answer is on what people should be working on. I think that's part of a group that maybe I could be part of, but it's not for me alone to say. But I think as long as you prioritize the pieces and you have a natural evolution through the age grades within your program, I think at a club you've got a unique environment, and that you can really set that curriculum from U11 all the way up. And high school, you got a 4-year window, and then the provincial program, Sean and Con are already doing that. So certainly the 3 that we've identified for the national program work, but we might get to a point in the next couple of years where all the regions in the country are tackling that contact area, and it's something that we no longer have to make an area of focus. We can move on to something else. Maybe it is looking at how we beat defenses by going over them. So we start looking in how do players utilize kicking in the game? I don't know, but for us, the 3 works now. But I think as we're starting to see the game evolve, I think the message then, if what I could say is that look at our practices in high school and club, and then look at how much of it is closed outcome sessions and how much of it is open-ended sort of game-based learning where coaches are active within the session. I think if you're in the latter bit there, then you're doing your players a service. I think you're going to get the most out of your athletes.
Perfect. And just one last question before we move on. A question here from one of the high school coaches. What resources or drills or games do you kind of utilize to help build game awareness in players? Talked about game-based drills and stuff like that, but is there any other resources?
Yeah, I think so. Let's just flip to this little piece here, only in that I just want to show you how we would design an activity. So I don't have an encyclopedia of drills and stuff I use. I don't have that. What I'll do is if we just backwards design. So what are the things that we want our players to accomplish at the end of a session? Okay, so then what is the appropriate number of players to be within the game? What's the level of contact? Let's create the restraints that will allow us to get the outcomes, but at the same time allow the kids to play. So whatever that happens to be, you can determine whether it's full contact, it's touch, it's unmodified, that's fine. And then we have to constrain the game to get the outcome. So for example, if we were looking at getting players to be able to pull the ball to a second layer, we would create a game where potentially if you could tag the first receiver before he makes that pass, it's a turnover. If we want to encourage line defenses to get up into the backfield, if you tag a guy in the second layer at the ball, it's a turnover, where in the first layer they get to reset a breakdown. So it's just about changing the size of the field and then changing the constraints on the game to get your outcome. There isn't a magic bullet there. It depends on your team. You've honestly just got to be flexible in understanding that the size of the field matters. The number of players in the field matters in relation to the number of touches, and then the constraints you put on it. So what are the rules? You can either make a negative constraint, so hey, it's a turnover for this, or you can reward points for success. So if you hit a guy on an unders line, then it's an extra 5 points. Or if you kick the ball into space and you score, you get 10 points for that. Or if you make 3 passes before a tag, you get a point for each. So these are all little things you can do there. If we look at the context of how we would design activities. So if we use a coaching model of a whole part whole or a game zone, skill zone, and if we need clarity on what those are, we can come back to it through Sean. We would design sort of the part sessions or the skill sessions based on the way we play. So if we were using a 1-3-3-1, this would be a first phase attack off a scrum left. So the scrum was here. We struck middle with our centers and our 7, and then everybody has started to move into their shape, keeping a front row on a rewind, and then everybody else is going to their place. So when we talk about the shape, it's just about allocating resources. And then the process of using our shape as shuttle, I told you I wasn't going to use him anymore, but there we go. It's like throwing a grenade and then see where the defense goes. So the gray guy here is, he's starting here, but we really like to get him there. So if we draw a little box around, so let's use that blue box, that's a picture that we would create. You can debate whether the 5 is on that side or that side. That's fine. It doesn't matter. That's probably how a defense organizes. So then we would set up an activity that looks like this, which looks like the shape or the picture we created out of our shape. So inside the yellow box is the same thing that's inside the yellow box right there. The blue box is the entirety of the picture, and we've now created our 4v3 in the wide channel. So understanding that our attacking players are going to start here where they're gray, outside the winger because he's probably there already. And then as this guy carrying the ball attacks the dude with the pad, he does his little work. We've got a clear out player. As soon as he starts moving, everybody else is live. And these defenders have to come from spots they would likely come from in a game. So the winger could be deep or he could come flat. The B defender or the A defender could slide out. We could have guys folding in, and then the fullback's got to cover the whole deep area, and then we play. If you wanted to turn this into a game, you could have the same activity on the other side of the field, but have white attacking red, and then you get points for scoring or points from defending. And after these red guys have attacked for a while, they go to the other side of the field and they play defense. And at the end of your 20-minute session, you accumulate all the points, and the winning team has to give a consequence to the losing team, or something like that. So you can create some competition within your team that very much looks like a game. It's open-ended in that the variables are there in the way the defense moves, in the way that the attackers align. You can create rewards if they can score off of a shape that looks like it has more than one layer, then you can get a bonus point. There's all kinds of things there you can do within that activity to really challenge players and challenge the pictures they're seeing. But I guess the end point is that when we play in our 1-3-3-1 and we strike middle off our scrum and we go to play the ball off that middle breakdown, we get something that we're familiar with because we've trained it multiple times. We train it every day, and we work on the variables that come within that. You could add another defender. You could have the fullback fall down. There's all kinds of things in a rugby game that happens. But within this pattern, there's going to start to recognize these pictures and to create frameworks on things that have been effective and things that have been ineffective. And then through the questioning process, we can determine whether they're sort of on the same page or anyway.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's great. And then I'll save some of the other questions too for the end. I'll let you get into that.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I mean, this is the last slide. It's one slide, and these are just my thoughts on how we can support sort of national team athletes as they return into a club high school Ontario environment. I was talking to Jack Henrati, who runs Rugby Nova Scotia, and he made the point that often with the Nova Scotia, or at least he's seen with some Nova Scotia coaches, that they get a player into the national program and he comes back from competition, and the thought might be, okay, well, mission accomplished with that guy, and they sort of put him on the shelf and focus on, okay, who are the next guys? Let's get the next crop ready for the U18s. And we often don't focus on the player who's gone through the first stage, but there's a long pathway still ahead for that player. So we've got to remember that when a player comes back from their first Canada under 18 experience, or maybe their second or their third, or if you're a university coach out of the 20s, there's still a lot of work to do there. As a national team coach, I would offer to challenge returning players to take leadership roles. Find out where they're comfortable. Like, what was the thing that you thought went really well about your experience with Canada, or the part that you grew the most, and challenge them to take a leadership on that within your program. Certainly within our program, we talk about leadership roles. If I just quickly go to our review process, one of the things that we would do is we would take our team and we break them down into the requisite units for us. So we use attack, defense, contact area, scrum, and lineout. Each group has a lead coach, but then it also has a lead player that have shown some leadership skills within our context. And then we populate the chart with the rest of the players in the team. But what we end up with is, if the red team is playing a game and we need to focus on the contact area, we'll lean on this lead player and his supporting crew of guys to sort of drive that message and training amongst the players. So if James is on the call, so I'll use an example. If he was in the Canada contact area, and you as a high school coach said, "Hey James, what'd you learn there?" Well, I was in the contact group, and we had to analyze video and present to the team, and we had to have sort of interactions with our players, and lean on him within your environment to sort of be that guy, right? He doesn't have to take it on. You're still the coach, but lean on him to sort of organize the guys and to get the metrics out to them, or, hey guys, this is what success looks like for us. So I would offer that you lean on those guys for leadership roles. The second one is, I think you have to continue to fill their toolbox. And one of the things I mean by that is not just pass, catch, tackle, clear out, the key capacities of rugby, but also what are their positional skill requirements. But a lot of that stuff is done in one-on-one coaching. You as a high school or club coach can be working with this player regularly on little activities outside of training. The national team player should be training more than a recreational high school player or club player, so they can be doing one-on-one stuff. On top of that, there's also the problem of positional changes and the skills that are required in their position, but they play different positions in a national program than they do at a provincial program. So I'm going to use David Skolin again as an example, because he's in my universe at Streetsville, and that at the national program, he plays hooker and throws lineouts. But unlike most of these players that are in the national program, when they go back to their high schools, they probably play 8, 9, 10, or 12. If you take our 50 guys that went to San Diego, of the 50, I bet you 40 of them play those 4 positions. So he plays 8-man at Streetsville, but that doesn't mean, like, he's still throwing 50 lineout balls at practice every day, and he throws all the lineouts in our game. Because for him to develop as a player, he needs to throw lineouts in competition. But at the same time, we run him running off the base of a scrum, because he's a dynamic player. So as a high school or a club coach, I think managing the needs of the player with the needs of your program and team is important. We're not saying a player has to play where he plays for Canada, but help him develop those necessary skills. So if they play scrum half for Canada, get him passing off the ground, even though he might play 10 at the club or at the high school, is totally fine, right? This next one is watch video with them. I think watching video with the national team player is different than watching video with the rest of your high school or your club team. I think you're looking for different things, and I think you're spending a different kind of time. You're probably watching with your high school team, at least I do, to teach the game, big picture movements. We might focus in on some core skill stuff, but it's different than the national team player. But you as an educator, if you're a teacher, if you're not, you're a coach, you're still an educator, is that you could get the player to set goals before they have their high school game or their club game. So say Oakville's playing Mississauga on a Friday, and James's coach is there. He can say, okay, James, what are your goals for this game? And get James to record them in his binder. He has one because he's been in the national program. He's got a notebook. He's going to write down his goals, and then you're going to film the game and make the game available to him. And then you'll schedule a one-on-one. Maybe it's 20 minutes before practice or an hour before practice, where you're going to get James to show, what are his thoughts? Did he achieve his goal? What were the big work-ons? And then you as the educator, whether it's a coach or a teacher, are going to ask questions of that player to get them to reflect. I mean, that's all we need. It's just a learning process. And then lastly, if you have a player in your high school club or provincial program that is keen on rugby and wants to go forward and wants to play at the highest level, you have to put them in an S&C program. The players in Canada are just, at the moment for playing international rugby, are too small. They're not doing the work. It's too late by U20 to start the process. It's got to be before. So whatever that looks like, whether it's opening up a weight room or connecting with a men's player, clearly spends time in the gym, or encouraging him to go to an academy like Upright or something like that, or the Ontario Academy. These are the things that you want to do. Make sure they're in an S&C program. It has to happen. That's all I got, Sean, outside of the review process. That's it.
We actually have a couple on the review process, so I don't know if we want to address those now or wait until
Sure. I can go to that now if you want.
Sure. Yeah. And then,
okay. So here's our match review process for players. So we talked about dividing the guys into groups that look like that. So we have two groups right here because, as we remember, just a reminder, when we go to the NA4, we bring two teams, Canada Red and Canada White. So each of these blocks have 25 players per. We organize our lead coaches and then our lead players with their support staff or their support group. I think in this last tour, we didn't even call them lead players. We just put players. So I was responsible for defense, red and white, and I might have 4 guys from each team. And I don't think we actually identified a leader, which is fine. Lead by a group consensus. So what will happen as we lead up to a match is that we will develop goals. So it'll require the group of guys to meet with their coach and to sort of pretty informal. We'll sit around a table somewhere after a meeting or before a meeting, and we'll sort of facilitate for the first time what goals setting would look like and what's appropriate, what's measurable, realistic. And then we would sort of leave the players to go away and to sort of get those goals. And the first time we do this, there'd be another check-in where they would go away and develop the goals and then come running by the lead coach again so we can ask some questions. But then we will get the teams together, and each unit group will present their goals to the team in advance of the game. As we get moving forward after match 1 and we go to match 2 or match 3, we can probably skip the second coach thing. We would just have the players come in and give us what they think their goals are going to be. We'd have a great conversation there. We'd ask some questions about the last game or things that they're seeing, and then they would finalize their goals and they would present them in a team meeting. We would then play the match. We would have the video. The video would then be made available to players, and the players would all organize in a group. So all the contact area guys would get together, all the defense guys would get together, and they would watch the video and measure a performance against their goals. They might also have a tagging sheet that they've been given by their lead coach. Hey, I want you to analyze all the breakdowns in the first 20 minutes and score them on a scale of 3, 2, or 1. And then, find me video evidence of a 3 and find me a 1. So there's little review tools we can give them. So there's parameters. The players will do this on their own with the tool and the goals they've already created. And then they will meet again with their review coach before our team meeting. Generally, we're in a 24-hour period at this point, and they will present their findings to the lead coach. We require them to come with video. They're not allowed to sit there and just talk to us. They must show the video as evidence. And then once we have that sort of conversation, really the job of the coach there is to just respond to what the players are giving them. Ask questions, get them to reflect. If you see opportunities to improve the understanding of the gameplay with the group, then take those opportunities to ask questions about what you're seeing. Hey, do you see what I'm seeing? And what happens when you do this? Look at the way the defense responds. So there's an opportunity to coach them up. And then once you've had that conversation, we then get back together as a team, and each group will present their findings to the team. I think the worst thing you can do in a representative program is to have 40 kids sitting in a room and a coach at the front with a video going and pointing out the things that are going well and going wrong. I think if you give it to the players, you get a deeper understanding from them. And then we reflect, and then we start again before the next match. While all the team reviews going on, the players also have their own individual review to do. So they'll get the same video they got for the unit stuff, and they'll generally be given, they'll develop their own goals. This would be in isolation. They don't have to meet with the coaches for that. They're going to play the match, and then they're going to review their performance based on their goals and the team worksheet that we give out. And the worksheet might be for game 1, just looking at their involvements in the contact area. So we would look at how accurate they are, or did they engage bad guys, tacklers while the ball carrier is still on their feet, little things like that, where they'd tag the sheet, and then they would sit down with the review coach to go over. And again, they've got to produce video. If they don't come with video, then there's no meeting. And then they get a process to reflect, and then we start the whole process again before the second game. That's the player review process. We also have a coach review process as well, which is daily. So every day we would have a morning meeting where we go over the day. What are the things we're trying to get out of the session? We would then set up the preview for the players. We would execute, and then in that evening we would review all the sessions. Did we achieve our goals? Did we get what we wanted out of it? Hey, things we would do better, etc. And then we would start the planning for the next day after the review. And then in the morning meeting on the next day, we would just preview the day, make sure everybody's still on the same page. Nobody had any dreams about how we change it and et cetera. And we would do that daily with the coaches. So they're long days, but they're challenging at the same time. And I think at the end, I think if you're getting people to ask questions, and I think you've been pretty successful.
Perfect. So we have a couple questions here, and one of them is just if you can go into a bit of detail in terms of what that player preview looks like when you're previewing sessions.
Oh, sure. Let me just pull one up here. So this was a session. When was this? This was a session on January 2nd. We have our goals here, or our core values. We would then go into what's the purpose of the session. So by the end of the session, players will understand the need for urgency in getting off the ground and realigning, protecting the inside shoulder, the tackler, and getting in the backfield to prevent a wide attack. So there's 3 little bits there. You'll notice it's summer attack, summer defense, because when we play games, we've got the big voice, small voice. So there'll be a coach assigned to the attacking group and a coach assigned to a defense group, or they're assigned to the north side of the field and the south side of the field, and they've got to be firm in our language because they might have the defense group and then quickly we change the game and now they've got a group in attack. So they've got to understand the outcomes. All the coaches have to understand the outcomes in both attack and defense and be able to challenge the players with questions. So this was the KPIs for the session. So going off to the ground, the players should have been pretty clear on what we were looking for. Part of that would be to present it to them, to go through the preview, and then we'll check for understanding at the end. So we'll go around the room. Hey, what's one of the purposes of today's session? And we keep going around the room. We might ask the same question over and over again, but we'll try to get some consistency. We've got video on this one. I don't exactly remember what we were looking for in the video, but here we are. So we'll show them video. We'll isolate a couple guys. We'll ask questions about what they see and the tendencies, and then we will move on. So we've got some video evidence of whatever we were doing. And then we got to get into the session plan. And I think the session plan is important because if you can alleviate the surprises to the players, I think you minimize the anxiety that comes with sort of the pressure that's coming up. January 2nd would have been the day before we got into our 2 games against the South African regional side. So I can tell you the guys were pretty nervous there. There was a lot of unknowns and questions, and it was a new environment. We moved to a new hotel and a new city, and there was a lot of stuff going on. So this is what the session plan looked like. It's broken down by minutes, though the coaching team within our program are happy to abolish the minutes as we go, because if we're not seeing transfer, then we're moving on. This one was late in our tour, so I'm just looking at it, and there's not a ton of game stuff. Obviously, we've got some defensive games that we would use, and then the attack versus defense would have been game-based, 15 on 15 with some things, but and then our hygiene is our nuts and bolts. So there's the training session, pretty short and sharp, and then we would get into this is what we're doing, and we get on the field. I'm not entirely sure what the next. So this one we identified, these were our hygiene groups. So we would, before we even go out there, we would list for them, these are the groups, you're in group 1, group 2, group 3, come find your name. And then when we get on the field, they would already know group 1's going with Adam, group 2 is going with Scott, etc. So the training session itself, we minimize the amount of time we're standing around for organization. Between each activity, we'd flash for water. That would generally be done by the therapist or the manager, and then we're back into the next unit. So that means for us, there's not a lot of time for stopping. We challenge the coaches to minimize that. If we're going to check for understanding, let's do it on the fly. Let's do it in between the water breaks, but let's not stop the session in the middle of an activity, because we want to make sure the players are playing with some pressure. We can coach on the fly and ask questions as we go, and then feel free if we decide the big voice decides we're not getting what we want out of the activity, then we just stop it and we get into a little clarity session or a learning block. Then we get back into the session. I hope that helps. This is not consistent in this session preview, but I think the important piece of the preview is that any new language is clear before you go on the field. What success looks like is clear before you get on the field. If you can use video, I think you're better for it. And then they have to have the training plan there so the players see exactly what's coming, so there's no surprises when they get in the field. There's no standing around with people wondering where to go. This one doesn't have a field map, but putting a field map would be pretty common for us. So, for the hygiene, we would have a picture of a rugby field and we draw little boxes around, and this is where group 1 is going to start. Then the rotation goes this way, so they know exactly where to move, and there's no, there isn't any confusion. And then within those small groups, we would have guys doing the timing, and we'd use a whistle system. One system, you got 30 seconds left, double whistle, it's over, you got to move, sort of thing. And
we have a couple, broader questions now.
Sure.
So we can move on to those types of questions. So we have one here in terms of, so you spoke about the review process for players and coaches. What does your personal review process kind of look like as you evaluated
I think there's yeah, for me, it's I do a lot of reflecting after the tours and the days. There's a lot of reflecting there. I try to get feedback from coaches I worked with before, so I'll generally sit down with them and we'll get a debrief from them on how they think it went, both as a whole program and then my performance. Rugby Canada generally sends out a survey monkey to the players or to the families, and then they'll give me that data later, of course, without player names and things like that. But a lot of it is, certainly I think just like the players, we do it because we want to be challenged. So a lot of that review for me is looking at, we'll watch the games over again. Hey, what were the themes when we came in? Is there evidence of success there by game 3? And then looking at, what are the things in time management we would have done better? What are the things in the way we manage sessions? So there's a lot of just personal reflection. I have my own book, just like the players do, and I'm taking notes daily. I usually finish with like a little diary at the end of the day. Hey, these are the things I really think went well. These are the things that I'd like to fix or looking forward to tomorrow. So it's just constantly reviewing the way we conduct things. And I think also being open to changing the way you do it. So this review process for us works at the moment. Somebody on this call might have a better one. And if you do, flip it to my email and I'll steal what I can and make it happen.
Sean and Mike, I think what we'll do is we'll pull that to some closure here. Mike, before we do a final review, are there any final points you'd like to make?
No, I think that's it. I hope people got something out of it. I tend to ramble, so forgive me.
First off, Mike, I can't tell you, that was outstanding. From a Rugby Ontario point of view, and speaking as a club coach and ex-high school coach as well, I can't believe how much I took from that and the direction that Rugby Canada, with people like you in leadership at U18, Kingsley, Jamie, Adam at the top level, what we're seeing now, and I'm speaking to the coaches out there, there's no more secrets. No. Whatever's happening with Rugby Canada now is going to be delivered directly to the provinces. And it starts off right from when you looked at key areas of focus. We were on a call last week with Kingsley Jones, national men's team coach, and he's doing the same review process with the senior men. And he chose the contact area, one of the 3 areas Mike and his U18 program are looking at. So big takeaways from me today. Focusing on those key areas that you've mentioned, and then organization, and then the delivery of your team sessions that you have with yourself as the lead, and then your coaching group. You can just see the amount of detail that's put into it. And it's been a big focus with our coaches in Ontario, and why we're driving that Rugby Ontario philosophy and support documents on our website. So what we hope to do is provide resources for coaches across Ontario and Canada, and then the learnings we take from a high performance program like you're running, we want to download those onto our coaches. And I know Sean will feel the same as me. I'm so glad we videotaped this, because this will be a resource that we'll be able to watch once, twice, 3 times to get the big takeaways. And then finally, the review process. If I'm a high school and club coach, you go, how could I possibly have time for this? But the way you presented it, being player driven, and we all know that players like watching themselves on video.
And then make highlight tapes.
Talking about themselves, especially teenage boys. And the girls are even better at the personal review. So by putting it onto them, the growth is excellent. So thank you very much for everything you presented to us today. I thought it was outstanding.
My pleasure. Thanks.